Good morning, everyone. It's our pleasure to welcome you today for a new version of these monthly IEA Africa University webinars. So today we will discuss a very interesting topic, which is a new topic of study by the IEA, and which is the role of critical minerals in clean energy transitions. We are very lucky today to have three of the main authors of the report who are joining us and who will give you the main findings of the report. So thank you very much to you, George, Jeremy, and Casey for being here. And I give you the opportunity to, of course, introduce yourself, and then I pass over to you for directly going into the report findings. Before that, just as a note of background, for those who are new to those monthly webinars, I just want to take a second to show you to discuss who the IEA is for those who are not familiar. So the IEA is an intergovernment organization which is based in Paris and which is at the heart of the energy dialogue and the dialogue on transitions to a clean and a clean energy future, and an energy future with universal energy access. So to do a bit of history, the IEA was created 50 years ago with a very strong mandate on energy security related to oil and to fossil fuels, because it was after the first oil shock. So this mission related to energy security is still at the heart of our work. But as you will understand from today's presentation, the scope of work has been broadly enlarged, and the IEA is today covering all fuels, all technologies. And basically, we concretely do three main things. First, we collect and provide unbased data related to the energy systems. So this is why you might be in touch with our colleagues to provide every year the energy balances, to provide all the latest statistics which help us keep the pulse of the energy sector and understand where the world is how the world is evolving in terms of energy consumption and needs, for example. Two, we provide policy advice, so we work with policymakers to support their decision making on energy policies. And last, we support implementation with concrete activities that can be capacity reinforcement programs or any other type of support to help the concrete implementation of energy policies. Today's webinar is organized under the framework of a program which is funded by the EU, which is about capacity reinforcement on energy data and energy modeling and long-term planning. So we are specifically focused on 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but also very, very happy to welcome energy professional and energy experts from other countries of the continent. So we have many activities like those monthly webinars, and we are very happy to welcome you to all of those activities. I already invite you to save the date for the next IEA University, which will be about biofuels, and we will have a joint presentation by the IEA and by the UN FAO. And if you need any further information, please feel free to reach out through our WhatsApp groups or to contribute to our LinkedIn community. So without further notice, I want to pass the floor to my colleagues, starting with Georges, to present to you this very interesting piece of work that was released in the last months of May about the role of critical minerals in clean energy transition. So thanks to all for your attention, and over to you, George.
Thanks, Arno. I'll try to share my screen now. If you could close yours.
Marina, could you put George co-host, please? Okay, you shall be able to do it now, George.
Thanks. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, clear.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Arno, and thank you everyone who's tuning in today. Very pleased to share the key findings of this important report together with my colleagues Jeremy and Casey. So I'll try to provide a bit of an introduction, discuss the demand and supply trends of minerals, and then I'll turn it over to Jeremy halfway through to discuss the 6 key areas of action in the report and explore the ESG issues of the report. Maybe briefly to introduce myself, I work in the Energy Supply and Investment Division of the IEA, and I focused mostly on the demand section of this report. Otherwise, I work on digitalization and energy, mobility, and tracking clean energy progress. So first, some important context. Over the past year, we've seen a growing number of countries pledge to reach net zero emissions by around mid-century. More than 40 countries in the EU have now committed to this goal, representing about 70% of global GDP and emissions today. Of course, pledges are only the start of the journey, but if these are followed through, this implies a massive acceleration in clean energy deployment. This means a lot more electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, electricity transmission and distribution lines, all of which are essential to move us onto a more sustainable path to avoid the most severe impacts of climate change. But that also means we will need much more of the minerals and metals that go into these technologies. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and graphite, all crucial to battery performance, longevity, and energy density. Rare earth elements that go into permanent magnets that are vital for wind turbines and EV motors. Solar panels are not very mineral intensive as such, but the sheer size of future solar markets means plenty of additional demand for silicon, silver, and copper. And the infrastructure of a cleaner and more electrified energy system also matters. Copper is a cornerstone of all electricity-related technologies, and the expansion of electricity grids needs a huge amount of copper and aluminum. Many technologies that we will need for a clean energy future require significantly more minerals than that of fossil fuel-based counterparts. We're not considering steel in this analysis or aluminum outside of electricity networks, but it remains striking to see the changes in mineral use implied by energy transitions. For example, a typical electric car requires 6 times the mineral inputs of a conventional car, and an offshore wind plant requires 13 times more mineral resources than a similarly sized gas-fired power plant. Over the past 10 years, renewables have started to dominate investment in power generation. And as a result, the average amount of minerals needed for a new unit of power generation has increased by 50%. The world has enough resources to make energy transition work, but that is no guarantee that supplies of all of these metals and minerals will be available when and where we need them at an affordable price. So a key message from this new analysis is that whatever your perspective on energy sector or energy transitions, pay attention to critical minerals. They are becoming an increasingly important part of the energy debate and of global energy security. The challenges that they pose in energy transitions are manageable, but require early attention from policymakers to make sure that transitions can be secure, sustainable, and rapid. So the first question that we needed to answer with our analysis was, how fast could demand rise? For this, we conducted a detailed assessment of different scenarios and 11 different technology evolution pathways. And the short answer is that a concerted effort to reach global climate goals will require at least a quadrupling of overall mineral requirements for clean energy technologies by 2040. That's the outcome in our Sustainable Development Scenario, the SDS, a scenario that's consistent with the Paris Agreement. And an even faster transition to hit net zero globally by 2050 would require 6 times more mineral inputs than in 2040 than today. The main factor behind this increase is explosive growth in mineral demand for EVs and battery storage, closely followed by mineral needs for expanding electricity networks and the growth of low carbon power generation. But when you start to look into the details, you see that for some minerals, growth is much faster than the 4 to 6 times you see in the screen now. Demand for lithium in particular sees very rapid growth, varies depending on the precise strength of climate policies and the technology pathway. But in a scenario compatible with Paris, demand for lithium is more than 40 times higher than today by 2040, followed by graphite, cobalt, and nickel at around 25 times. There are two important consequences of this demand picture. First, it means that the energy sector is becoming a major source of demand for these minerals, which hasn't traditionally been the case. Take lithium, for example. 10 years ago, demand for lithium for energy-related applications was minimal. Already today, EVs and battery storage have displaced consumer electronics to become the largest consumer of lithium. And if we get on a trajectory consistent with the Paris Agreement, by 2040, 90% of lithium supply will go to the energy sector. The upward trend for other minerals is not quite as dramatic, but shows a similar rise. The second implication relates to the cost structure of producing the clean energy technologies themselves. We're all aware that technology learning and economies of scale are bringing down the costs of clean energy technologies. But as this happens, this also means that raw material costs now account for a larger share of the total. Batteries are a good example. They are much cheaper than they were 5 years ago, but raw materials now account for some 50 to 70% of total battery costs, up significantly from just 5 to 10 years ago. As a result, higher and more volatile mineral prices could have a significant effect on the costs of transforming our energy system. What do clean energy transitions mean for mining companies looking to supply the energy sector? Here, the implications are quite dramatic as well. Today, for example, revenue from coal production is 10 times larger than revenue from energy transition minerals. But there is a rapid reversal of fortunes in a scenario that meets climate goals as coal use goes into structural decline and energy transition minerals gain a tailwind from growing demand and upward pressure on prices. Combined revenues from energy transition minerals overtake those from coal well before 2040. So there's a strategic opportunity for companies that some are already taking to position themselves in growing sectors at the expense of declining ones. However, this doesn't necessarily mean a smooth transition for employment in these sectors. There are countries like South Africa or Australia with significant resources of both coal and critical minerals, but that is not always the case. There's a huge task ahead to manage the social consequence of change in the energy sector. Going into more detail on the supply side of the equation, each supply chain has its own specificities and complexities, but an essential point is that production of many energy transition minerals is more concentrated than that of oil or natural gas. These high levels of concentration, compounded by complex supply chains, increase the risks that could arise from physical disruption, trade restrictions, or other developments in major producing countries. For lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, the world's top 3 producing nations control well over 3/4 of global output. In some cases, a single country is responsible for around half of worldwide production. The Democratic Republic of the Congo accounts for 70% of global cobalt production. China is responsible for some 60% of global production of rare earth elements. And when it comes to processing and refining operations, the level of concentration is even more notable, with China the decisive player in many of these areas. China has invested heavily in these mineral supply chains to support the growth of its battery industry, manufacturing of wind turbines and solar panels, and the expansion of its grid. And that leads to the key question. If mineral demand picks up quickly, as it will do if climate pledges are turned into climate actions, will supply be in a position to respond? We've looked closely at today's production capacity and the new projects under construction, and you can see the results on the screen. In essence, as things stand, the production outlook is geared towards a world of gradual, insufficient action on climate change. Or to put it another way, investors and suppliers do not yet appear to be convinced that the world's policymakers are going to turn their ambitious climate targets into action. So we see a looming mismatch between the world's strengthened climate ambitions and the supply of the critical minerals that are essential to realizing these ambitions. This mismatch is not uniform across the board. Some minerals are expected to be in surplus in the near term, while the balance for lithium chemical products, battery grade nickel, and key rare earth elements looks tighter. However, if we look further ahead in a scenario consistent with climate goals, expected supply of lithium and cobalt from existing mines and projects under construction meet only half of projected requirements by 2030. One precondition to narrow this gap is for policymakers to make clear not just their long-term goals, but also to fill in the detail on how they plan to get there. This means clear milestones for action and for near-term clean energy deployment this decade. So it'll be critical to reduce investment risks and encourage capital flow to new projects. But there are other factors at play as well. New projects typically have a quite significant lead time, including 4 to 5 years on average for construction, as well as additional time for project preparation and permitting. These long lead times would need to shorten considerably if we are to see a swift and sustained ramp up in supply. There are other supply challenges as well. There's no shortage of resources, but the highest quality resources are depleting. For example, the average copper ore grade in Chile declined by 30% over the past 15 years. Lower quality ores require more energy to produce, putting upward pressure on production costs, emissions, and waste volumes. So the ability to supply to keep pace with an acceleration in energy transition should not be taken for granted. As we put together this work, another question that we heard regularly was this one. How clean are clean energy technologies in reality once you account for the emissions along the mineral supply chain? To answer this question, we compare the choice today between buying a mid-sized conventional gasoline-fueled car versus a battery electric car, looking at the life cycle emissions in each case. First, here's the conventional car. There are emissions associated with the manufacturing process, but the majority of the life cycle emissions come from the fuel used during the car's lifetime. Now, a battery electric vehicle, you'll see that the manufacturing process is associated with slightly higher emissions, largely due to the battery. But even if you assume the high end of emissions from these processes, the difference with a conventional car is not huge. So the life cycle calculation effectively comes down to the electricity used to power the vehicle. In a world that takes climate change seriously, the global average electricity mix would result in roughly half the life cycle emissions of a conventional car. But if we recalculate for countries with the cleanest electricity mix, those life cycle emissions halve again. Emissions along the mineral supply chain do not negate the climate advantages of clean energy technologies. That said, mineral producers still have more to do to minimize emissions that do occur. As part of the research for this report, we found a large variation in emission footprints of different producers of energy transition minerals. There are many ways for producers to improve their environmental performance by switching to less polluting fuels or to low carbon electricity, and by improving the efficiency of operations and technologies. And alongside emissions, there are other well-documented issues with social and environmental performance of some mining operations, such as impacts on local water quality, inadequate attention to worker safety, or abuses such as child labor in small-scale mining operations. There's growing scrutiny of these supply chains and rising pressure on manufacturers of clean energy technologies to source only those minerals that have been produced to such high standards. But if these standards do not rise across the board, and manufacturers are competing for a small pool of responsibly produced minerals, that could create additional market strains. And now I'll turn over to Jeremy to expand on this as well.
Thanks a lot, George, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Lashley, and I work in the IEA's legal department. With my colleague, Casey Michaels, who will be joining us for the Q&A, we focused on environmental and social impacts, as well as international coordination. So as George has shown, the rising importance of critical minerals in a fast-changing energy world requires energy policymakers to expand their horizons and consider potential new vulnerabilities and new responses. So the report outlines 6 key recommendations that draw on the IEA's longstanding leadership in energy security issues, as well as the examples of different national and international initiatives in this area. So first, measures to support adequate investment in diversified sources of supply. As mentioned, early and clear signals from policymakers are critical to give companies the confidence that they need to commit to new supply. But as everyone familiar with energy security knows well, security of supply also lies in diversity of supply. So in this context, resource-owning governments can support new project developments by reinforcing national geological surveys, streamlining permitting procedures to shorten lead times, provide financing support to de-risk projects, and overall raise public awareness of the contributions that such projects play in the transformation of the energy sector. But one of the key insights from our long experience of energy security at the IEA is that a comprehensive approach cannot focus solely on supply. So it's vital for governments to step up support for technology innovation, which can alleviate strains on supply by reducing mineral intensities and open up possibilities for substitution. So just to give an example, 40 to 50% reductions in the use of silver and silicon in solar cells over the past decade have been critical to enable the spectacular rise that we're seeing in solar PV deployment today. A third area that is set to become much more important in the future is recycling. A fourth area encompasses measures to increase the resilience of supply chains and improve market transparency. As we know from our existing emergency response programs, regular market assessments, good data, and periodic stress tests can help policymakers identify possible weak points, evaluate potential impacts, and devise the necessary responses. Strategic stockpiling can in some cases also help countries weather short-term supply disruptions. The world also needs to step up efforts to tackle the environmental and social impacts of mineral developments, including the emissions, local pollution, the treatment of worker safety and welfare. Solutions to climate change cannot work on the back of injustices or poor environmental performance further up the value chain. Suppliers have to do their due diligence to identify, assess, and mitigate these risks. And finally, we need to strengthen international collaboration between producers and consumers. An overarching international framework for dialogue and policy coordination among producers and consumers could play a vital role. So these 6 pillars can provide the basis for a new approach to mineral security. There are huge opportunities here if governments can act together. And as for our part, the IEA is determined to play a leading role in helping governments around the world to anticipate and navigate potential vulnerabilities and avoid damaging outcomes for our economies and the planet. Next slide, please. So the growth of mineral supply not only plays a vital role in enabling clean energy transitions, but it also holds great promise to lift some of the world's poorest people out of poverty. Mineral wealth can, if exploited responsibly, contribute to public revenue and provide economic livelihoods for many. As you can see on this chart, many countries, including in Africa, rely very heavily on mineral exports. However, a high reliance on export revenue from minerals has often led to underinvestment in economic transformation, making the economy more vulnerable to changes in global commodities prices. These problems may be particularly problematic in countries where mineral extraction contributes a large share of fiscal revenue. So this underscores the effective institutional and legal governance are required to ensure that mining revenues are used to ensure benefits for the local community and to support diversification of the economy. Next slide, please. Essentially, security of supply and ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance, are not separate. They're actually very closely linked. Customers and investors are increasingly calling for responsible and sustainable volumes to be produced. If the environmental and social performance doesn't rise, it can shrink a pool of supply available to meet demand and add market strains. Further, poor environmental and social performance can also lead to supply disruptions. Production sites may be shut down or disrupted due to disputes, for example, over water access, or as a consequence of regulatory actions to enforce child labor or human rights violations. Meanwhile, dam failures at tailing storage facilities can lead to extended shutdowns and large remediation and repair costs. At the same time, criminal and civil liability related to environmental damage or corrupt practices can raise the cost of production, with severe reputational and financial implications for the companies concerned. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, there are many types of environmental and social impacts, and performance varies significantly between different producers. So this includes climate change, land use, water management, waste, governance, health and safety, and of course, human rights. For most of these impacts, there are a number of different options to mitigate these harms. There are both engineering solutions as well as policy and regulatory solutions. Next slide, please. So as ore grades decline and production figures increase, volumes of mining waste have been reaching new heights. Tailings are particularly troublesome, as they are often stored in dams, posing contamination risks for nearby soil and water bodies, and the hazard of dam failure. In 2019, the collapse of the tailings storage facility at Vales mine in Brumadinho, Brazil, led to mining waste surging across the surrounding areas and the death of over 270 people. Sustainable waste management can ensure that instead of causing environmental harm, mining residues are used as resources to support economic development. Waste management policies can promote recycling, the use of mine waste by other sectors, and technologies that reduce waste generation, such as tailings dewatering techniques. The industry can also contribute, establishing benchmarks such as the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management. Next slide, please. On the social impact side, artisanal and small-scale mining poses a number of special challenges for countries. For energy transition metals, this is most relevant in the context of cobalt production, where 10 to 20% of cobalt production comes from ASM. Regulatory protections at ASM sites are often ineffective or non-existent. So there are unsafe working conditions, there's a lack of personal protective equipment, inadequate safeguards against the worst forms of child labor. So at these ASM sites, workers often face difficult or dangerous working conditions in addition to child labor in certain countries. Due to these risks, there could be a temptation for companies to disengage from the ASM supply chain entirely. However, this approach may paradoxically worsen the situation as it fails to address the root cause of child labor, which is poverty. So as an alternative to disengagement, companies can seek to work together with multi-stakeholder groups to promote formalization of ASM activities. These efforts to formalize ASM activities may improve the health and safety conditions and reduce human rights concerns, particularly for child labor. Despite some promising results, the long-term viability of this model remains unclear. So stronger commitments to formalization are needed, both from the industry and from governments. Next slide, please. And finally, on international coordination. Many international initiatives have emerged in recent years to tackle various supply chain challenges. For instance, the OECD's work with the International Conference on the Great Lakes region resulted in the broadly recognized due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Initiatives such as the Cobalt Action Partnership and the Copper Mark also facilitate the adoption of mineral-specific responsible sourcing standards. Multilateral efforts to enhance capacity building and knowledge sharing can address key resource gaps between countries. Institutions like the World Bank and the OECD and extractive-specific initiatives like the IGF and the ERGI can provide technical assistance to mineral-rich countries. Despite many success stories, the proliferation of international initiatives increases the risk of duplication and inconsistency. So this is why the IEA believes that a high-level forum for coordination could play a key role in standardizing environmental and social standards while ensuring security of supply for consumers and outputs for producers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George and Jeremy, for those very interesting and content-rich presentation. So now we have a lot of time for questions from the participants. So I invite you to ask any question using the Q&A functionality. You can also raise your hand and we can give you the floor. You can ask questions or also share any comment, remark, or perspective from your own national situation and perspective related to minerals. maybe while participants start asking their questions, I would like to ask a first one and a broad one for you, and maybe for you, George. So we have seen in your slide that specifically cobalt and platinum are very highly concentrated in the African continent and in the central and southern parts of the continent. Could you remind us how those two minerals, so cobalt and platinum, are strategic to clean energy transitions?
Yeah, thanks, Arnaud. So cobalt in particular, so both of these minerals are actually also very concentrated in terms of their application for specific clean energy technology. So cobalt is really, among all these technologies that we assessed, is really used in batteries. It's not used in solar PV or wind, those technologies. It's really about batteries. So both electric vehicle batteries and stationary batteries. So it's quite, with the rapid growth in EV that is projected in both the STEPS and the SDS, so the stated policy scenario and the sustainable development scenario, there will also be, of course, an increase in cobalt demand. So with the STEP scenario, a 6 times increase between 2020 and 2040 for cobalt demand, and a 21 times increase between 2020 and 2040 in the sustainable development scenario. So very rapid growth. Of course, the demand for cobalt is kind of tempered by a shift towards higher nickel chemistries, which offsets the amount of cobalt that's needed. And then platinum similarly is highly concentrated in terms of the need for these minerals in fuel cells. So hydrogen and hydrogen technologies. So I don't have the exact numbers in terms of growth, but again, it's going to be quite critical as we see rapid scale up in hydrogen and consequently increased demand for platinum group metals.
Thank you very much, George. I see we are receiving some first questions from the group. There is one that might come from Zambia, from what I understand, which relates to the question on prices. So I'll read it. It's the first question asked by Chanda Karen Shalway. So I don't know who would like to take it, but the question is, in the past, there has been little correlation between production volumes and international prices for mineral. And the person is quoting the example of copper in Zambia. So the question is, should we anticipate growth in production volumes because of the rise in prices in recent years? I don't know, maybe for you, George, if you want to touch a bit
Sure.
on this question related to price.
Yeah, I could take a stab. So, copper, I think especially is quite a diversified demand, both in terms of in the energy sector, in terms of requirements in transmission distribution networks, in EVs, in kind of conventional energy technologies as well. They're found in vehicles. So there's kind of a more diverse, I guess, mix of demand sources for copper. I think unlike lithium, where we see a very dominant, increasingly dominant share of demand required from batteries specifically. So I'm not sure exactly how.
Sorry, just to support what you say, I'm just sharing one slide from the report about price movement for several minerals, and yeah, just highlighting, as you say, that lithium has been much more volatile than copper. Sorry, didn't want to
and I guess
interrupt.
No, thanks. That's helpful kind of background. So yeah, I mean, just I guess generally, these prices are not solely linked to supply and demand. Like we're seeing increase in prices of lithium recently, or cobalt, which is linked to expectations of post-pandemic economic rebound, high expectations for future growth, and then ultra loose monetary policies with low interest rates. So I guess it's a combination of factors. So the hope would be that price pressures would induce further supply to trigger. But as I mentioned in the presentation, the lead times for projects can be years. So responding to price fluctuations on kind of a quarterly or yearly basis is hard for mining companies. So it's, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, George. There is another very interesting question, which is not about the critical minerals for batteries nor for solar PV, nor hydrogen, nor wind turbines, but which relates to nuclear. So, Casey, I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit on that. So the question is, do you have any insight to share about nuclear minerals and their long-term sustainability?
Thanks, Arnaud, and thank you for this question. And just to clarify, the uranium and the nuclear materials and materials needed for nuclear production were not within the scope of this report. So we don't have detailed demand and supply projections within the minerals report. But just to share a few thoughts that are based on other pieces of analysis, the key difference between nuclear materials when we're talking about uranium versus those like cobalt and these other clean energy transition minerals as we're describing them is really about what we see for demand within the clean energy transition over time. And really the picture for nuclear is quite different. And in most of our projections, nuclear is really either roughly staying at its current rate for the next several decades, or starting and then eventually starting to fade, particularly in Europe and in North America, where we're seeing life extensions followed by closures. So the main picture for that is that we don't see the type of demand growth for uranium. Some of you may know it's also a relatively concentrated market, similar to some of the other minerals, with a few large producers like Kazakhstan and a few others taking a big role. But because of this lack of growth pressure, we wouldn't expect to see the kind of need for an explosion in demand and supply of uranium. So that's part of the reason we decided to exclude it from the report in the first place. Thanks for the question.
Thanks a lot, Casey, for those elements. There is one question maybe for you, George. I think it's more clarification on the emission debate. So I can again share the slide you were presenting on emissions from internal combustion engine versus electric vehicles. So I don't know if you want to answer to Yanda about it and explain maybe again.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Yanda, for the question. So, this chart is basically comparing, over the lifetime of a vehicle. So in this chart, we've assumed a vehicle lifetime is 200,000 kilometers. Over that lifetime, of course, there's emissions, from the production of the vehicle body and the materials associated with that. That's in green, and then the light blue and darker blue parts are related to battery for the battery electric vehicles. So your question, whether it's offset by increases in emissions from electricity. Yeah, so of course, like for generally for vehicles, if you look at the full life cycle emissions, whether the overall life cycle emissions is generally going to be dominated by, especially gasoline fueled cars, by the use phase emissions, so the operational emissions from gasoline, burning gasoline to propel the car. In a very high, coal-intensive grid. So in the EV charts you see here, both the base and the high GHG minerals, those are global average electricity mix under the SDS. So imagine a new battery electric vehicle coming off the assembly line today. It's going to be consuming electricity both in 2021, but also 2030, potentially in 2035, when the electricity grid is going to be much cleaner, particularly in the SDS. I think it's halving in the cutting by half in the next decade. So it's unlike in a gasoline car where it in fact probably increases in emissions over time because of losses in efficiency, whereas an electric vehicle, because it relies on this electricity supply, it will actually decline in terms of emissions over time. in a high coal electricity mix. So the emissions would be comparable to a gasoline fueled car. So I think it would be approaching 40, but it's kind of like the worst case scenario in a country that has is not going to be decarbonizing. So if you imagine coal-fired power plants and not changing over the next 15 years. Whereas this kind of global average will give you a general sense of where the globe is at over time. And then the cleaner electricity on the very right is, a high renewables mix or high low carbon electricity mix.
Thank you very much, George. We also have a very interesting question related to recycling. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to take this one on the potential for recycling material and maybe exporting recyclable materials.
Sure, thanks a lot for this excellent question. Recycling is really one of the key points. It is one of our 6 key recommendations. Because we found in our study that recycling could actually end up meeting about 10% in the growth of overall demand in critical minerals. So it is significant. So perhaps if I can just discuss a few actions that could be taken to scale up recycling, to create a market for recycling. So policy support is needed to encourage the collection and sorting, particularly for batteries. Economies of scale play a major role in improving the economic viability of recycling, and policies that support collection and sorting rates for electronic waste and batteries, among other circular economy measures, are a good starting point. But there's also improved product design practices that can also facilitate efficient recycling processes, and policymakers can encourage companies to adopt more recycling-friendly designs using policy approaches such as extended producer responsibility schemes. Enhanced international coordination will also be critical to harmonize regulations on international movement of batteries and ensure a level playing field. For example, countries may need to work together to ensure that products exported for secondary use are held to similar end-of-life standards in the destination country. And a recent example that we have of a policy related to recycling is the EU's proposed sustainable batteries regulation that aims, in fact, to create a market for recycling, an entire value chain within the EU, which is also supported by significant investments. So to your question, yes, I think there is potential to create markets for recycling throughout the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. And just sharing again one very insightful finding from the report. There was one slide we did not put in this presentation, but I'm just sharing as it's quite compelling to see in our projections how by 2040 we could reach 10% of recycled materials as part of the new batteries for lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. So just to say that there is much more material in the report itself about recycling, and that we really that you guys really assessed the potential for recycling in the coming decades. So there is also one question maybe which relates to climate change, climate impacts. As we all know, Africa is very much vulnerable to climate impacts. We've not directly discussed interlinkages between climate impacts, climate risk, and the supply of mineral. So are there any risk related to climate for these questions on supply? And do you have any perspective to share on that, and potentially ideas to build more resilience? I don't know, George, maybe this one can be for you.
Yeah, thanks, Arnaud, and thanks for the question. I can start on this question. Happy for others to chime in as well. So I guess at the IEA, we're increasingly looking at climate risk in terms of electricity security, energy security. And I think this was covered in the report as well in terms of exposure to climate risks for minerals. So I guess there in recent years, more frequent droughts in major producing regions and higher water intensity in ore production is bringing this need for more sustainable water sourcing to attention. So as an example, in 2019, the worst drought in more than 60 years severely affected some operations in Chile. Similar events occurred in Australia, Zambia, and others. And over 50% of today's lithium production is concentrated in areas with high water stress. And then 80% of copper output in Chile is produced in mines with high water stress levels as well. So yeah, at least in terms of water, I'm unsure of the other kind of climate impacts, extreme weather events and others. But yeah, in terms of water, there's a discussion in the report if you'd like to learn more.
Thanks, George. And perhaps I could add a little bit more. I think there's an element to this question about maybe the kind of ethical dimension of an area being very vulnerable to climate impacts and how minerals itself can kind of exacerbate some of those impacts, particularly in the area of water use, but also in the area of other environmental impacts. And just to add a few thoughts on this, this is partly why our recommendation and our discussion of these issues is really emphasizing the need for planning ahead or at the beginning of project life cycles to understand the different impacts on local water supplies, on waste, on environmental harm, and on communities and land use throughout the entire life cycle of a project. So it's a very important point that areas that are water stressed, having new facilities that use a lot of water can exacerbate the water stress. But at the same time, different technologies can be adopted and careful management over how water use and water supplies are allocated at the beginning, and fully understanding what those impacts would be can help improve decision making. And in some cases, this may be to require a specific project to adopt a certain type of technology that reduces its water use or reduces waste. And this kind of early stage planning at the environmental impact assessment stage can make a big difference for at least mitigating these impacts over time, and also potentially deciding whether or not projects should go forward depending on the potential harm of the project over its life cycle. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Casey and George, for your answers on this question related to climate change and environmental impact. There is one other question very interesting as well on sustainability of the current supply chains, and the fact that today the trend is that minerals are extracted in countries such as Congo or Zambia and shipped to China. There was a very insightful slide on the concentration of players and countries along the process for refining and treatment. I don't know, maybe Casey or anyone can touch on potential pathway for diversification of those midstream activities for critical minerals.
Thanks. This is really a critical question, I think, for most producer economies, because it really ties into the question of how to make best use of fiscal revenues and how to make best use of the resources and the value that's created in them. And just to say that from the IEA standpoint, I don't think there is a correct or a right way to organize production, whereas where it should be concentrated at one location or spread in other points. The issue we were trying to identify with this report is that high levels of concentration within one or two suppliers or one or two producing countries can lead to risks throughout the supply chain. That is, supply disruption in one country, if they're a very large producer, can really affect the supply all the way down the chain. So from that standpoint, we don't necessarily see it as a positive development if a single country is responsible for a very large proportion of production. But at the same time, I think the concern from the points of many countries is more about how do we make sure that we take advantage of the resource value and create linkages so that the values coming from selling mined products can support the local economy? And so far, the efforts on this regard haven't been particularly successful. I mean, one example is the Democratic Republic of Congo has faced a ban on export of copper and cobalt concentrates in the past. And ultimately what we saw is exemptions because there weren't yet production capacity, refining capacity within the country to really provide an outlet for that material. And at the same time, we've also seen some local content requirements, and there's real risks that this type of policy can lead to trade disputes, which obviously very much complicates the situation for countries. But at the same time, there are some really promising strategies that focus really more about how the revenues from development are used. And maybe that's towards subsidies and support of the processing industry, but it can also be used to strengthen other types of infrastructure and create a good investment environment, and also to develop local suppliers and other local industries that can support mining. Chile represents a really interesting example here. They've set up a strategic innovation fund that aims to support a local supplier industry with some great success. But obviously there are big transparency issues, and the issue of how to use fiscal revenue is one that needs to be thought over the entire economy rather than just focused on a specific resource. Obviously, this is a quite grand challenge, but we do know that there have been some efforts that have had some success.
Thanks a lot, Casey. We're getting many questions today, and one other very interesting from Yanda. I don't know, George, if you want to take it and maybe read it again for the participants.
Thanks, Yanda. So your question was around, the use of innovation spurring reductions in the use of silver in PV panels, which help to drive down the costs and increase adoption. So the question was, did you model any scenarios on the impact of technology options on emissions? In other words, for example, an alternative to lithium batteries. So indeed we did. So, the future is very uncertain in terms of the technology developments, across all these technologies. So there's different types of solar PV panels. There's different types of wind turbine gearboxes. Some rely on rare earth elements, some don't. And similarly, as you mentioned in the question, lithium ion batteries, some have very high use of cobalt, some have very no use of cobalt, some have very high use of lithium. So it really depends on those chemistries. So we explored 11 alternative technology development pathways, and we found indeed across these scenarios, for example, if let's say there's a delayed shift to high nickel chemistries for batteries, so that would increase cobalt demand or delay the tapering off of cobalt demand, or if we see a more accelerated shift towards solid state batteries, sooner than we might when we think in the base case, there would be much higher demand for lithium. So you can explore those in the report. Of course, there's kind of trade-offs. So if you think about EV motors, for example, we could go from motors that use permanent magnets. So there's a lot of pressure with rising prices of permanent magnets motors to shift away from those that require rare earths. So induction motors, but then those use a lot of copper or aluminum. So then you're kind of trading off one kind of demand for another. Similarly for battery chemistries, it's really the same story. And then there's also a question of how recyclable those batteries might be. So there are cheap alternatives, one called LFP, lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are increasingly used in China, which don't use cobalt or nickel. But at the end of the life, there are concerns that because of the low value of those materials, the recycling rates might be lower than we would want. So the future is very uncertain. We're trying to explore, the different pathways that we might see and how policymakers might want to respond to those uncertainties and challenges.
Thanks a lot, George. Maybe there is one question I can start answering related to the future of electricity provision for sub-Saharan African countries. So David is sharing with us that most countries in sub-Saharan Africa are adopting renewables with an objective of affordable and sustainable energy, as we see increased growth on the demand for minerals, which are by definition finite and not endless. Could the countries be pursuing policies which are not sustainable? So maybe just to give a perspective on the demand side, or all the power sector analyses that were conducted recently under the World Energy Outlook versions, we indeed see that solar PV is to be the new king of electricity, and in most regions, the cheapest solution to generate electricity. This is also the case in Africa, and more specifically in Africa, when we do geospatial analysis to see where people not connected to electricity are today, and what would be the least cost pathway to provide electricity to all Africans, we see that renewables is really the #1 solution, with a combination of grid-based, mini-grid, and standalone system solutions. So, and this is really the way we see that a universal electricity can be sustainably provided. To answer more the question on what is finite and or infinite, I would say that fossil fuels are not finite either. So generating electricity from coal or from gas would not solve the issue, and on the contrary, such renewable sources, of course, are consuming minerals, are components to their equipments, but then the source of generation, which is the wind or the sun, are by essence renewables and infinite. Please, Michael, Casey, Jeremy, feel free to jump on this question of the finite debate behind the minerals and renewables, or to take any other question that came up in the meantime.
Maybe the only thing I'd add to that is there's a bit of a question around what sustainable means and how to understand and define that. And one of the things that's quite clear is a lot of current production, regardless of whether we think about the finite nature of how long we'll be able to use these resources, there's a lot of serious environmental impacts that have major impacts on local biodiversity and water quality, and also land use and human impacts in surrounding communities. And one thing that's quite clear is, in the meantime, we need to get a handle on reducing these environmental impacts at the local, regional, and global level altogether. So that's just to say that even regardless of where we land on the issue of this, the long-term sustainability of these mineral supports, it's quite clear there's a lot of production right now that's not even close to that for a variety of reasons. So just to emphasize that point.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Casey. And I see time is running out, but maybe there is one last question from Tina, which reminds on how minerals are essential components of the clean energy transition that we are experiencing and the rapid growth we are expecting. So the question is how to ensure that these minerals and other key technologies can continue on the supply of sufficient mineral resources to support the acceleration of clean energy transition. So that's, I think, the entry question that all colleagues ask themselves when starting this work on the report. So we could take a lot of time to answer it. Maybe to wrap up, there's been those 6 points that were presented. I don't know, maybe Jeremy, if you want just to remind, or I can share again the slide on those key recommendations.
Sure, and thanks for this excellent question that, it's really the key question. As George set out at the beginning, really, if we're in a world that's, raising climate ambitions, then we're going to need, more minerals and, significantly more than we were using in the past. So really, we need to think about this in a really holistic way. And so as Arnaud mentioned, I think from an IEA perspective, these are really 6 areas where we can really make strides in terms of meeting these climate ambitions in terms of critical minerals. So in terms of ensuring adequate investment in diversified sources, promoting energy technology innovation, scaling up recycling, supply chain resilience, market transparency, higher environmental, social, and governance standards. And finally, and this somewhat encapsulates all of the above, is the strengthen international collaboration between producers and consumers.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy, for having wrapped up and reminded all those key messages. So we are out of time. I would really like to thank the three of you, Jeremy, George, Casey, for your time and for your very interesting presentation. I'd like to thank all participants for your participation, for your attention and your interest in this topic. So there is much more to learn about these key topics than what we just shared today. It's a 200 or 300 slides report that you can download and explore for free. The PowerPoint that was displayed today will be made available. There is one version that you can already download on the website, but we will also put today's version as a link in the YouTube video. You know, we record every webinar and post it, so you will be able to easily download it, and it will be uploaded in a couple of hours. So thanks again to the three of you. Thanks to all of you for your participation, and we wish you a very good day.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. And
Bye.
thanks for the great questions.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone.